Hi, Lenten greetings from the MarThoma Theological Seminary, Kalyan. Often we all might have come across doubts regarding the understanding of salvation. Do we achieve it through our faith, grace, or is it through our works? Even a basic question like "Are you saved?" is sure to bring a whole lot of confusion in our minds.
Maybe that's why we see Paul paying so much attention in teaching about salvation in his epistles. The passage for today's devotion is one such account of Paul teaching about salvation with emphasis on faith, grace and works. Let us read Ephesians 2, 1-10.
As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins, in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world and of the ruler of the kingdom of the air, the Spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient. All of us also lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our sinful nature and following its desires and thoughts. Like the rest, we were by nature objects of wrath. But because of His great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved. And God raised us up with Christ and seated us with Him in the heavenly realms in Christ Jesus, in order that in the coming ages He might show the incomparable riches of His grace expressed in His kindness to us in Christ Jesus. For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. For we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do.
Ephesus was a beautiful port city. An ancient Roman writer called her as the light of Asia. Being in the midst of this affluent commercial city, Paul carefully warns his new believers not to get carried away by the desires of the flesh. The desires led to sin, and in Paul's view, the person ultimately becomes dead. Death is not in the physical sense, but it is like moving away from the communion of God.
Paul presents hope even in the midst of despair. For in verse 5 he affirms that the lives in alienation from God were welcomed into the redemptive history of creation. This was possible by the life, ministry, death and resurrection of Christ.
To be alive with Christ is a state of new life. We enter into a new communion and intimate fellowship with God. This has got nothing to do with our merits or the physical works that we do. It's out of God's immeasurable love.
Paul's word stresses, it is through the grace of God that we have been saved. Grace in Pauline literature was a very important theme.
Let's go back to the Ephesian church. This church was a mixed community of Gentile believers and newly converted Jews.
The Jews were very strict and particular in obeying the laws, taking Sabbath, fasting and so on. Everything in short was reduced to a mindless ritual. To this understanding, Paul appeals that it is not by your works that you have earned grace. He asserts the fact that we cannot earn salvation through certain ritualistic observances.
Very true. Come on, we cannot bribe God to earn His favor or grace. That's a free gift from a gracious God. In simple terms, grace is God's riches at Christ's expense.
But that is never a license to remain lethargic or a passive believer. Paul here exhorts us to have faith. In verse 8 he affirms, "For by grace we have been saved through faith, and this is not our own doing, it is the gift of God."
For me, faith in itself is a powerful, dynamic verb loaded with action. Faith is not hoping God can, it is knowing God will. By knowing God will, we should be motivated to remain faithful. This is the implication of salvation. This results in us doing good deeds.
Yes, salvation is a progressive experience. It's a journey. Baptism thus becomes an initiation into this beautiful journey and should not be considered as a certificate for our salvation. Our life in its fullness is a journey to grow in maturity with God.
God never asked our permission to save us through Christ, but we are expected to respond to the salvation we have received. This requires us to shift our gears from boasting on the results of our works to responsive living according to God's will.
Friends, no one can make the journey of life that is marked by death all along the way to a new life single-handedly. It takes the power of God to break the deadly pattern of the old life. It takes the power of God to sustain this new life. This is the power of God found in grace.
God looks how we use our freedom, to which things we are giving priority. Every act that displeases God is a sin that distances us away from the fellowship of God. When we fail to lead a life in communion with God, we are transforming ourselves into children of sin.
Every Lenten season is a time to order and reorder the priorities in the light of our commitment towards God. Our fasting or prayers, the keeping away of things we love, should not be considered as means to please God. Rather, it should pour out like an expression of love and gratitude towards God.